Welcome back for section 18, where we're talking about pre-importation considerations working with customs brokers. Yet another important pre-import decision an importer must make is whether or not to use the services of a licensed U.S. customs brokers. Second bullet, as noted previously, a customs broker is an individual or company that acts as an agent for the importer in presenting customs entries to CBP. That agency capacity. That's the essence of the relationship. As we said when we talked about reasonable care and informed compliance, ultimately, it is the importer of record that is responsible for the accuracy of entries. Customs brokers are preparing entries on behalf of the importer as their designated agent, basically. It's important to mention, we've said it before, we'll say it again here, third bullet, USCBP does not mandate that importers use a customs broker. That is a strategic decision that an importer must make. And when an importer does their own entries, that's called being a self-filer. But again, there's no rule or regulation that says an importer has to use a customs broker. That's a strategic decision. As a note, at the bottom of the slide, for purposes of this training, it is assumed that importers do use the services of a customs broker. And actually, the image on the right-hand side, before we proceed, this is what a customs brokerage operation looks like. A series of desks occupied by what are called entry writers that are working with the importer, working with the overseas freight forwarder, sometimes working with the vendor to get the electronic version of all the necessary documents, the commercial invoice, the packing list, the bill of lading, etc., to prepare and submit customs entries. That's what it looks like. Nothing glamorous, but super important. There are a number of factors an importer should have in mind when selecting a customs broker. And before we proceed, let's just say that there are literally thousands of licensed customs brokers in the United States, both as individuals and business entities. There's lots and lots of competition in the customs brokerage field. It's highly specialized, but there are many competitors. And as counterintuitive as that may sound, it's true. When selecting a broker, when working with a broker, what we're talking about here are the things the importer needs to be thinking about. First off, let's be sure that the broker has the proper license and port permits to operate in an agency capacity on behalf of an importer. There's not too much fraudulent activity out there, people posing as brokers when they're not. That's a little hard to do in the digital age. But we just want to be working with brokers that we know that they're on the up and up, especially as it relates to the permits they need to operate. Second sub-bullet, this is really price of admission into the game. The broker has to have access to the automated broker interface, ABI as it's called, for the purpose of submitting electronic entries to CBP. We brought forward ABI in our definitions section, so we should know what that is. It's the electronic interface that entries are submitted to customs through. A quick trade tip: an importer can work with more than one broker at the same time, as long as there is a power of attorney in place with each broker. If an importer decides to work with a customs broker, it doesn't have to be one and only one. The importer can work with as many brokers as he or she likes, but every broker has to have a power of attorney. More on POAs in upcoming slides. Some other factors to consider: the total number of brokerage operations in the United States. Physical offices. Does the broker only have one office in Portland? Do they have two offices, but one's in New York City and the other is in Providence, Rhode Island? Or does a broker have 50 offices across the country? That could very well matter depending on how many ports we as the importer bring merchandise into. Second sub-bullet, the total number of employees and employees per office working exclusively in customs brokerage. In customs brokerage operations, the offices like the one we see in our image, it's not likely that the company, the broker, is only going to be doing brokerage. There'll be a freight forwarder. They could have a warehousing operation. That's what we mean by distinguishing between the total number of employees and how many people work in brokerage. Because a company could have 100 employees and have one working in customs brokerage. That's probably not a favorable ratio for an importer of record. The other thing is, you could have 100 people working in customs brokerage at a brokerage operation, but what's the average tenure of brokerage employees? Customs brokerage is a knowledge-rich area. It's one of these functions that requires a lot of intellectual capital, a lot of knowledge in people's heads. And the more people work at customs brokerage, hopefully, the more knowledgeable they become. So we want to know what's the average number of years of service in a brokerage operation. What else? Here's a good question to ask. The number of brokerage employees that are licensed U.S. customs brokers. Entry writers do not have to be licensed customs brokers. It would certainly be helpful if they were, but they don't have to be. That office with 100 brokerage people in it could have one person with a license. We as an importer would like to see that number be a little higher. Second sub-bullet, the existence of continuous education and training specific to customs brokerage. As we said a moment ago, this is a knowledge-based job, being an entry writer, working in customs brokerage. There has to be continuing ed and training. This last one is important too. Determine if the broker submits entries from a local office at the port of entry of an import shipment, or if the broker uses centralized operations for submitting entries. A service center in Nebraska that does entries for a customs broker in ports all around the country. That's allowed through USCBP. It's referred to as remote location filing. Some brokers take a different strategy and have a small office in each port so they can take advantage of local contacts with truckers and dray people, knowledge of local practices, etc. As the importer, one should make that distinction. Is it a centralized deal using remote location filing, or is it an operation in each port around the country? Continuing on, ascertain the level of expertise the broker has in dealing with specific products, be it footwear, consumer electronics, etc. Some brokers, not all, specialize in certain commodities. Perishables being imported from Japan, footwear coming in from the Dominican Republic and Central America. When it comes to classification and valuation, commodity expertise matters. We as the importer preferably want to align our specific needs with the expertise of the broker we're working with. Second, determine if the broker uses off-the-shelf software to run its operation or if the platform was developed in-house. There are lots and lots of off-the-shelf programs to use. Some brokers set up their own. Maybe it makes a difference, maybe it doesn't. We want to ask the question anyway. As a trade tip, some brokers specialize in very specific commodities, chemicals, wearing apparel, foods, etc. We need to know who they are and what they do and align their capabilities with our requirements as the importer. What else? Verify the existence of standard operating procedures for both the onboarding and ongoing management of import accounts. Implementation of a customs brokerage relationship between an importer and a customs broker is the make or break point in that relationship. And the details that are vetted out early on in an SOP, if it's done correctly, will pay dividends throughout the life of the relationship. We as an importer want to see some strict requirements from the broker in terms of their SOPs for onboarding and ongoing management of import accounts. Another important consideration, determine if the broker requires a parts file from the importer in order to properly classify goods. A parts file, that's just industry terminology for a spreadsheet, basically, that lists an importer's products, their item number, their internal item number, the product description, and the corresponding HTS number, and hopefully the country of origin of individual items as well. Brokers will use that parts file to set up an account during the implementation phase in that standard operating procedure to use, maintain, and update as importers continue to import existing and new product in the future. Last sub-bullet here, identification of value-added services offered by the broker, things like assistance with classification, which we spoke of, advice and help with binding rulings, protests, etc. Extra value-added stuff that brokers do in addition to entries. Last slide in this section. What are the KPIs the broker uses to measure its own business performance? How do they measure themselves? How many entries filed without a rejection? How many ocean entries submitted 5 days prior to the arrival of a vessel versus 4 days prior versus 3 days prior versus 2 days prior? That's what we mean by KPIs. Second sub-bullet, and validate the process the broker uses to execute an entry. What is the actual procedure? Does one person handle a file from start to finish, or is the process more of an assembly line with multiple people touching a file? That's some nitty-gritty stuff, but the importer of record should be asking these types of questions of the broker. Some offices like to have one person handle a file from start to finish. Other offices use the assembly line approach. We're not here to advocate for either. What we are saying is ask the question and understand how it works. This is the last slide in this section. Let's wrap up by vetting out issues like inquire if the broker pays customs duties on behalf of an importer, or if they require payment through ACH, which is the automated clearinghouse, which we'll be talking about more later, and have clarity. Here's the last one, probably the most important. Have clarity on the fee structure of the customs broker. How do they charge? What's the service fee? What are the ancillary fees? As a note, details on the pricing structure for customs brokerage is discussed in greater detail in an upcoming section, more towards the end of the entire module, but we will circle back on that subject. That's it for this section. When we come back, we'll talk about pre-importation considerations, this time the power of attorney.